Okay, today we're going to take a look at using the area model and number line to represent mixed numbers with units of ones, tenths, and hundredths in fraction and decimal form. So we're going to first start off by taking a look at a mixed number, converting it into a decimal, using the area model and the number line. So our directions are: shade the area models to represent the number, drawing horizontal lines to make hundredths as needed. Locate the corresponding point on the number line, and then label with a point and record the mixed number as a decimal. Okay. So first we can see shade the area models to represent the number. So we see we have 1 and 15 hundredths. So I'm going to first by shading in my 1. And there's our 1. Now we can see that now we have 15 hundredths. So now we need to take our pencil and create horizontal lines to create our hundredths. Okay. Now we see that we have 15 hundredths. So we know that we need to make a tenth and then 5 more hundredths. So we have 15 hundredths on there. So we can see that here's our 1, and here is our 15 hundredths. Okay, so now when we go to convert it into a decimal, we have 1 and 15 hundredths. Okay, now the number line has already been labeled for us. Now here's where it might get a little bit tricky, because if you notice, we're more than 1, but if you notice, there's only 10 sections between 1 and 2, which means each of these lines are represented as a tenth. So now you see that we have 15 hundredths. So what we need to do is go to 1/10, but because we have 5 more hundredths after that, then that means our number is right there. It's between 1 and 1/10 and 1 and 2/10. So then we could label this as 1 and 15 hundredths. Okay? Because these are tenths, we have to go in between. Okay? So let's take a look at another one. Okay? So now we have 2 and 47 hundredths. So again, using our crayon or pencil, we can shade in our 2 ones. Okay, and now again we need to create hundredths. Okay, we need to create 47 hundredths, so you know that we need to shade in 4 columns and then 7 more hundredths. So we end up with that. So now again you can see that we have 1 here, we have 1 here, and then we have our 47 hundredths. So we get 2 and 47 hundredths. Now again, looking at our number line, notice we're only looking at between 2 and 3 this time. We don't need to go all the way out to 0. So we know that we're more than 2, but less than 3. So again, this is labeled as tenths. And we know we have 4 in the tenths place, but we have a little bit more than that because we have 7 more hundredths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count to get to 2 and 4 tenths. Now my 47 hundredths is almost 50 hundredths. So when I go to label my point, I'm going to put it at almost 2 and 5 tenths. Okay, so you can see there's our 2 and 4 tenths, 2 and 5 tenths. So we can now label this as 2 and 47 hundredths because 47 is almost 50. Okay, so it is going to go between those 2 lines, but it's going to be closer to the 50 hundredths. Okay, and you know that from our estimating and rounding practice. Okay, so now let's take a look at using just the number line. So now again we have 2 and 95 hundredths. So now again, knowing what you know, 95 hundredths, you know that we have at least 9 tenths. So here's our 2 and 9 tenths. So 95 hundredths is going to be exactly between 2 and 9 tenths and 3. And then we could label that as 2 and 95 hundredths. And notice in our direction says estimate. Okay, but we know because 95 is going to be right in the middle. So now moving on to letter B here, we see we have 7 and 52 hundredths. So again, I'm going to find 7 and 5 tenths. Okay, so there's 7 and 5 tenths right in the middle. Now I have 52 hundredths. Now 52 is a little bit more than 50. So when I go to label my point this time, I'm going to be a little bit past the 7 and 5 tenths. And I can label that as 7 and 52 hundredths. Okay, so we're going to be a little bit more than 7.5. Okay. All right, moving on to our next page here. We're going to write the equivalent fraction and decimal for each of the following numbers. So again, you see that we have 1 and 2 hundredths. Now this is where it gets very tricky. You need to make sure you're understanding the difference between the tenths place and the hundredths place. So what might be easier is to do the fraction first. So we have 1 and 2 hundredths. Okay. So now to convert that into the decimal, this is where it gets tricky because we have 1, and if you notice our numerator here is a single digit, which means we have 0 tenths and then 2 hundredths. So that's how we would write this. And another way to kind of think about this is to think about it like money. We have $1 and 2 pennies and no dimes. Okay, if you want to make that connection to money. So now coming over to letter B, we have 1 and then 17 hundredths. So now to convert that into your decimal, we have 1. Now this is a 2-digit numerator, so I know I have 1/10, 7 hundredths. Okay. Moving on to letter C, we have 2 1s, 8 hundredths. Now again, this is just like letter A up here, so we have to be very careful when we go to write it as a decimal. So we have 2 1s. Okay. We don't have any tenths, and then we have 8 1s. Well, I'm sorry, 8 hundredths. So we get 2 and 8 hundredths. Okay. Now the next one we have 2 1s and 27 hundredths. Okay. So when we go to convert it, we have 2 and 27 hundredths. Okay. So again, kind of thinking about your 2 digits as your numerator. Okay. So 4 1s, 58 hundredths, can then become 4 and 58 hundredths. Okay. Then, moving on to our last one here, we have 7 1s and 70 hundredths. Now this one's slightly different. We have a 2-digit numerator, but that numerator is also a 10. So when we go to write it, we can write it as 70 hundredths, or we can also write it as simply 7 and 7 tenths. Okay. Now, moving on to the last one, we're going to draw some lines from dot to dot to match the decimal form, the unit form, and the fraction form. All unit forms and fractions have at least one match, and some have more than one match. So again, we have to be careful with those zeros. So if we take a look at our first one here, we have 7 1s and 13 hundredths. So looking through our middle section here, okay, I see that this one right here has 7 1s and 13 hundredths. So now I can connect these 2 dots. Now to turn this into a fraction, I look over here and I see, okay, here's my 7 and 13 hundredths. So now I can connect these dots. I'm using a ruler so that my line looks straight, but you can just use a free hand if you need to. So now our next one, 7 1s, 3 hundredths. Now again, be very careful of our units, 3 hundredths. Looking through our middle sections, this is 30 hundredths, 3 tenths, and here's our 3 hundredths. So I'm going to connect these two dots. And then again, coming over here to our fraction, we see this first one listed here is our 3/100ths. So now I can make this connection here. Okay. So now next one, we have 7 ones and 3/10ths. So looking through, we can see that there's actually 2 here that match. Now the obvious one here is our 7 3/10ths. But if we look at the one above it, we have 30/100ths. But we know that 30/100ths is equivalent to 3/10ths. So we can also connect these 2 points. Now coming over here to switching it over to the fraction form, okay, we're looking for 3/10ths or 30/100ths, which would be this last one right here. Now going across, notice how our 3/10ths, and over here we have 30/100ths as we go across to make our connection, because those two are equivalent. Now we look at our last one. Notice how this one is 7/10s and 3/1s. Well, this one should be pretty obvious, because we're dealing with 73, which is the same in unit fraction form and decimal form. So that concludes our problem set. Thank you for watching. Please give the exit ticket a try next.